The next one we will look at is the edge hypothesis proposed by Louis Binford. And Binford states that at the end of the Pleistocene, hunting-gathering populations increased in density, and this was because of the loss of coastal lands because of melting glacial ice. This also led to increasing sedentism. People simply didn't have the ability to move around like they used to because of the population density. He then suggests that human populations began to surpass the carrying capacity of the land. So they were having a hard time getting all the resources they needed. Food shortages, he proposes, would be first felt at the outskirts of natural habitats, so at the edge or these marginal habitats. So to ensure an adequate food supply, the peoples living in these marginal areas domesticated plants and animals. So domestication was a necessity. And he believed that the only reason people would leave that hunting and gathering life way is because of necessity. Again, the problem here is that the modern data indicates that many of the earliest domesticates are actually found in very rich environments. So there's quite a diverse and abundant resources available to human beings. Then we have a hypothesis developed by David Rindos. He's an Australian archaeologist. This is referred to as the co-evolution hypothesis. And Rindos built this off of the accidental hypothesis, which was proposed by Edgar Anderson. And Anderson stated that the domestication occurred because humans naturally alter their habitats as they exploit it. They return to the same place year after year to collect food. They will kill and weed out the economically useless species. They cause soil disturbance. They leave garbage pits behind. And because of this, domestication just happened. It wasn't anything intentional. So all of these species were adapting to the new conditions that humans were kind of creating, and humans then adapted culturally to take advantage of these species. Now what Rindos says is he kind of pulls in elements of biological evolution and refines Anderson's theory. It explains how domestication occurred, but not necessarily why. And he did focus on plants, but it could be applied to animals also. So he kind of sees domestication as just a step in a natural plant-animal interaction, and that there's actually this symbiotic relationship between animals and plants. He does say domestication is accidental. You don't have to have intent involved with the initial domesticates, and he actually uses ant colonies to demonstrate that. But he talks about 3 levels of plant-human interaction, and first is the incidental, where hunters and gatherers choose the plants they like, and then of course seeds and so forth end up in the trash and latrines, and we get inadvertent stands now of these plants. The next level is specialized, so now humans are starting to tend the plants that show up in these inadvertent stands, so it's a more active role in the domestication process. And then finally we have agricultural, which is full-scale farming, and it's all about intent and manipulation. What's important to understand is there's no general model that's been developed that explains the adoption of agriculture adequately in all parts of the world. So we have to keep working at a regional level and incorporate all the factors, including environment, population density, and size, and even social organization, to really try to understand why food production occurred. So there's probably multiple factors involved, and again, we're just trying to figure out what all of those were. What's kind of interesting is we do see some general patterns in these early centers of domestication. In almost every place except Mesoamerica, sedentism occurs first. So people settle down into one region for a while. Then domestication occurs. But in Mesoamerica, we actually see the reverse happen. People are still relatively mobile when we start to see the first domesticated plants occur. We see decreased infant mortality. People are in one place for a longer period of time. It's less stressful on infants. And this also leads to population growth. The consequences of this adoption of agriculture, there are a lot. Jared Diamond is often quoted as saying that this was the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Now, agriculture can provide more food than most foraging strategies, but it's not necessarily going to give us all of the nutrients we want. And it took a long time for the early agriculturalists to figure this out. So some of the things that we see soon after the adoption of agriculture is increased paleopathologies. So these are ancient diseases. So we see a lot of infection. We see a lot of chronic malnutrition, and particularly a nutritionally based anemia. And this shows up in skeletons, and the skull becomes very porous, so we see a lot of holes and so forth in it. People are shorter, so we see decline in stature. We see enamel hypoplasia, which, if you can look at this particular graphic, are bands across the teeth, and that actually shows periods of malnutrition. Tooth decay becomes a huge problem, so we see increasing carbohydrate use, which means there are increased starches and sugars in the diet, and this results in tooth decay. And a bad tooth, you can die from an abscessed tooth. So we actually do see that as a big cause of death in ancient populations. And we just see a shorter lifespan in general. Some of the other things we see are increased warfare and violence. So societies are starting to become non-egalitarian, and we start to see quite a few social differences, so we see increasing social complexity. So these particular graphics are just trying to show, this is Mayan warfare, but we also start to see social differences. So if we look at this middle graphic, we can see a tomb. We have an individual there that actually has sacrificial victims buried with them. There are a lot of different pots, there's obsidian, all sorts of different things. So by the amount of things that were in people's tombs, we can determine how important they were in that society. And then complexity, social complexity, we start to see large communities arise, and eventually leading to urbanization and cities. So that is kind of a really basic introduction to why we study food production in archaeology.